John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 52. And just a little recap on what had been going on in the last couple issues. Last issue was a filler issue where one of John's friends from the past, who we've never met before, visited John to try to get a demon, or multiple demons removed actually. And John helped remove the first couple, but the friend told John that there was something like 60 demons in him. So John kind of got pissed off and mad at his friend, and also his friend, I guess, during this exorcism, shit himself. So in the issue, we don't actually see any of the exorcism for the most part. Most of it is just John sitting in a laundromat, waiting for his sheets to get cleaned, which seems pretty innocuous, except that this laundromat is special because it seemed like everybody that was in there with John either was dead or they were waiting for someone who had just died to meet them at the laundromat. So once John realizes this, he kind of freaks out and leaves the laundromat. And that's the end of the issue. We don't really get any resolution other than we know that now one of John's friends died. And also a quick fun fact about that issue, which I didn't really bring up while I was reading it because it didn't have anything to do with the story. But this is the first issue where John's bisexuality is mentioned. And he's not saying it to anyone. It's actually inside of his narration captions, where he kind of says offhand that he's had a relationship with a guy or two. So I had to throw that in just because it's a little important history, since that character is one of the first bisexual characters I can think of. And another interesting thing about that issue is it's not in the same timeline as the rest of the story that had been going on that Garth Ennis is writing. So it could be any time in his life that happened, you know, like after Newcastle or whatever. Because right now, everything's going pretty good. He's living with Kit. His life is getting kind of back on track. And in issue 51, he had his own apartment where his friend came. I guess technically he still probably has his own apartment, but it seemed like this one kind of was a snapshot of something that happened in his life instead of being in continuity with the story that was going on right now. And speaking of that story, we're back at it with Garth Ennis writing on Hellblazer number 52. And first things first, we got the cover here. We see John Constantine is in the background looking very angry and disgusted. And in the foreground, we see skulls in front of him. There's a man who's bound in chains that's hanging upside down in front of him as well. And in the foreground, and this seems to be the person that John is looking at very disgustedly, we see a hand holding a butcher's knife that has the Freemason symbol on it. And the hand looks pretty nasty and old and decrepit, but in the knife, we see the reflection of a demon's face. And this is a fantastic cover by Glenn Fabry, one of my favorite cover artists for this series. And like I said before, this is written by Garth Ennis with art by William Simpson. And as we open the book to the first page, we get punched in the face by a very graphic, bloody image of a man who is laying across a brick wall that has fallen over. And this man is dead. His eyes are blown out of his skull. His torso is completely cut open in half. It's almost like someone ripped him in half, and his intestines and everything are showing. In fact, it looks like parts of his skin have been removed. You can actually see the musculature. So it seems like some areas have been chosen to be skinned. We also see the title of this storyline written in blood on the wall as if the man wrote it. I don't know if the man actually wrote it or if it's just for graphic design, but the name of this story arc is called Royal Blood. This is part 1, and the name of this part is called The Players. And we get some narration that says, "Last night was New Year's Eve. Mickey Foster met a man he thought looked familiar in an alley near Camden Tube Station. Mickey offered to come home with the man in exchange for money, and he opened Mickey's throat to the cold with something thinner than air. Now, Mickey lies where the man dumped him when he ceased to be an amusing toy and became a castrated sack of bloody shit. He's slightly frozen to the wall, and his last conscious thought, that the man was familiar, He's been on the telly, is frozen into his punctured brain. In 18 minutes, Mickey will be found by a young woman walking home from an all-night party, still tipsy from all the wine she drank there. She'll scream for 2 minutes until she coughs blood in the back of her throat and faints. Happy New Year. Then we cut to a naked man in the same alley, huddled behind some trash cans, and he's covering himself with a blanket, and the narration continues. The man who killed Mickey sits trying to sleep, but the demon in his head won't let him. He searches for shards of a butchered memory. He was someone important, even famous, but he did something wrong, and now, who is he? Then we cut to a man in a suit who's staring out of a window. It looks like he's pretty fancy because he's smoking a cigarette from one of those cigarette holders. So he's probably some sort of aristocrat or important person. And the narration continues. Another man who knows exactly who the man in the alley is and what he's done sighs irritably as he looks out over a city that has just become a feeding ground. He becomes quite angry when he realizes who he's going to have to ask for help. Then we cut to John Constantine, who apparently is the man he's going to have to ask for help. And it seems like John has just woken up. Him and Kit are in bed, and he's watching her sleep. And the narration continues. A third man sits up in bed with a nasty hangover beginning to fade. As always, he forgets the pain as soon as he sees the woman beside him. He listens contentedly to her breathing for a while, kisses her neck, and then gets up. Then we get a panel of John getting ready for the day. He's drinking some tea. He's putting his tie on. And he's got a big old smile on his face. And the narration continues. Still unable to face anything solid, he roasts his throat with a mug of tea and decides to take a stroll. The tatty string vest and the boxer shorts go on. Then the trousers and the shirt he's picked up off the bedroom floor. Scuffed Oxfords, a tie with a Guinness stain, and a trench coat he wouldn't swap for love nor money. And he's off into the cold January morning to see what a new year will bring. He grins to himself as he goes down the stairs, thoughts of drinking and kissing and loving and dancing in his mind. He's smiling a lot more these days. There's always something interesting, he thinks, something to get stuck into. All you have to do is catch its scent and then the hunt is on. So it seems like as he's walking out of Kit's apartment, it seems like he gets a whiff or a feeling that there's something or someone he needs to track down. Then we cut back to the second man in our story who was the fancy guy smoking with a cigarette holder, and we find out that his name is Sir Peter Marston, and he's being driven around in his Rolls Royce and he's looking for someone, and the narration says, one of the many reasons why Sir Peter Marston dislikes John Constantine is that the man is so confoundedly difficult to find. And inside the car, Marston is saying, bugger it, all bloody morning in this damnable place, and not a sign of him. And he's actually talking to his driver, not himself. And it's like he's trying to explain to the driver why they're looking for this person. And he continues, he's usually to be found here, I'm reliably informed. You'd almost think he knew I was coming, wouldn't you? And just as he says this, he looks out the window and he sees John standing in front of a building and talking to someone. So he gets out of his car. And as he's walking over to John, John sees him. And John turns towards him and raises his hand and says something. But to Marston, it just sounds like gibberish. And then in front of Marston's eyes, John becomes blurry, and as his vision refocuses, now instead of John standing in front of him, there is a tall African-American man standing in front of him, and that man is saying, I said, do you want speed, Granddad? And Marston is horribly embarrassed by this, and he's like, I beg your pardon. My God, Christ almighty, no. And then the guy tells him to piss off, so Marston turns his back and begins to walk away, but then he hears a familiar voice say, what the frig do you want, Marston? And Marston turns around and sees John and says, Constantine, but I thought that fellow was you. And John says, I know, I'm the one who made you think it. Answer the question. And then Marston gets mad because of the way John is talking to him. Apparently he thinks John should talk to him with more respect. And then begin to argue for a second, but Marston remembers that he came here for a reason. And he says, we have our differences, but I think we should put them aside for now. Something important of mutual interest has arisen. And John looks at him and says, has it really? Do you know something, Marston? When I got up today, I felt really good. But I wasn't out of the house 5 minutes when I heard on the radio that some kid's been found cut to bits just up the road. Doesn't sound like an average job either. Sounds like something I'm gonna have to look into. You know what I mean? So you can stick your mutual interest up your arsehole, Marston. And then John begins to walk away, and Marston says, but Constantine, that killing is the item of mutual interest. I think we should talk more later, don't you? There are things to do this afternoon. Come around about 4, won't you? This isn't pleasant business, and
Unless we do something, it won't be just a single dead poofter we're worried about. Thank you for your time.
And then he hands out one of his cards to John. And as Marston walks away, the narration says, "That put the bastard in his place," thinks Sir Peter. "Always good to get the last word in. Let the hoi polloi know where they stand." And so Sir Peter, who knows now that it's Constantine who will have to stop what's loose out there, looks forward to lunching on good red meat and fine wine. And as he's walking, we do see that Marston has a bit of a smirk on his face. He thinks he's shown John who the better man is. And as he gets back into his Rolls Royce, he tells the driver to go back to the club. And as the driver goes to turn the ignition key, he says, "Slight problem, sir. The keys appear to be gone from the ignition. I'm sure I didn't remove them." Then we cut to a panel of the keys of the Rolls Royce, and they're sitting on a table in between John and Kit. And they're in some sort of cafe, and Kit is saying, "What are you going to do with them then?" And John says, "I don't know. I was about to bung them down a drain, but you never know." And Kit agrees and then asks, "Marston, I've heard of him, haven't I?" And John answers, "Yeah, he's a fairly prominent figure in the House of Lords. What he really does is act as a kind of fixer for government and big business interests. He likes, discipline. Brendan and I stitched him up for $5,000 once. Dead easy. Got our hands on a set of Polaroids. They showed him tied to a bed while a nice young lady in a nurse's outfit whipped the arse off him. Not really original, but there you are." And then Kit asks, "And what are you going to do now?" And John kind of leans back and grabs his tea and says, "Good question. I wouldn't mind screwing another few thousand out of the frigger. I'm a bit short." And then Kit kind of nonchalantly says, "Yeah, you've been at my place just over a week now, John. Moving in, are we?" And John, looking kind of coy, says, "I don't know, to be honest. Do you want me to?" And Kit answers, "I wouldn't mind if John Constantine moved in. I'm just not so sure about all the baggage that comes with him." And John replies, "And by baggage, do we mean ghosties and things that go bump in the night?" And Kit looks at him sternly and says, "We do." And John answers, "Well, I can't blame you for that. Shit. Look at what there is. All the things I'm mixed up in, all the trouble." And then Kit jumps in and cuts John off and starts mocking him, saying, "Oh, I'm a disaster. All I do is bring pain and misery to those that cross my doom-kissed path. I walk alone towards Armageddon while the world draws back from me aghast." And John laughs, saying, "Oh, thanks a bunch. My innocent little sweetheart, butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, ruthlessly rips the piss out of me yet again." And Kit kind of laughs at this and looks at him and says, "Yeah? Well, you take yourself too seriously sometimes. What are you up to today?" And John answers, "I had a look into this business before I meet with Marston, I suppose. Pays to have an edge. Hang on a sec. What about what you were saying?" And Kit looks at him and says, "Well, what about it? Do you want to move in with me?" And John says, "Yeah, I just don't want to bring any of my baggage with me." And then they stand up and begin to walk out of the diner now that their meal's done. And Kit says, "Tell you what, we can give it a try. But I'll kick your arse for you the first time something goes bump in the night, okay?" And then John looks at her with a little smirk and goes, "Even if it's me?" And then she calls him a pervert, and then they kiss. Then we cut to some really evil-looking eyes staring out from some planks in a wooden fence, and he's staring at someone sitting on a park bench. And the narration says, "The man with the demon in his head has found someone new to play with. Over there, just over there is a human who hardly deserves to live. A dead mind like so many of them. A piece of walking meat. Meat that will separate and rip and slide apart very soon indeed. The demon doesn't care who gets to have fun with it. It just likes to cut, and everyone in this world can be cut." Then we get a panel of the man's hand coming up to his face, and it seems like the body is fighting itself. And the narration says, "The man is hunting through his mind again, whether the demon likes it or not. Everyone knows his name, the beautiful wife, the strain of who he is. But the demon has memories of its own, and the man can't help but see them. Memories of all the good times." And then we get a flash of what the man is seeing from the demon's memories of what the demon considers the good times. And what it is very Hellraiser-ish. There's a man hanging in the center of a room. He has ropes and chains tied to each of his four limbs, and they're pulling in different directions. And the man, of course, is screaming out in pain, and he begins to scream even more as something begins to burst through his chest. And we see this is actually like the demon himself bursting through the chest. And the demon's face looks like a skull, but it has very pointy canines, kind of like a vampire. And he also has bony horns that look like a crown
protruding out from his skull. And inside of the demon's mouth, he now has the man's heart and other parts of him like his esophagus. And the man who's watching his own heart being ripped out of his chest is screaming, of course, and the demon is saying to him, "You will have to excuse me. Don't get me wrong, I'm having terrible good fun inside you, but I'm called above. Commitments, you understand." And then since the man doesn't answer and he just continues to scream, the demon says, "You don't? Well, let me put it this way. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep." Then we cut to the scene of the night before where the man who is possessed has a man strung up in the alley, and this is the man who was dead on the first page of this comic. So we're seeing the events that took place that led him to being murdered. And the narration over these panels says, "What would bring ecstasy in hell brings only a tingle here. But down there, the food never varies, an endless menu of the damned. Here, and this is not its first visit, the demon can get its blades into the choicest of delicacies, the innocent." So like I said, we are in the alley from the night before. We have Mickey Foster, who is the man who was killed on the first page. He is hanging upside down, and in front of him is the possessed person. We don't know who he is, but it seems like maybe he's a celebrity or someone who's very, very important. So as Mickey Foster hangs upside down, he's begging for his life, and he's saying, "Now look, mate, I've got lots of friends, okay? Let's not be silly buggers." And then he sees the possessed man raise a butcher knife and also step from the shadows into the moonlight. And Mickey gets a good look at his face and he says, "Wait a minute. I mean, you're him. Holy frickin' Jesus, you're..." But before he can finish naming the attacker, the demon-possessed man slices through Mickey's eyeballs. And then we cut to the end of this violence where we see the body of Mickey hanging in the alley. And the narration says, "Young and reasonably fit, this one lasts 5 hours. When but a human child in ancient Atlantis, the demon learnt skills to keep a human conscious, even if its guts were torn out and splashed the length of hell's creation. And food that begs you not to eat too much of it is nothing short of charming. Meat cut from the thighs and forearms provides the man with nourishment, and for the demon in his head there is a veritable banquet. Despair, misery, agony, and terror. Best of all is the exquisite taste of shock, when all the rules are broken and the victim finds himself in hell before he's dead. The demon's appetite is whetted, and it goes to look for the main course. It takes its time. There's a whole city outside, and it's spoiled for choice." Then we cut back to the present, where John is now walking into Marston's office, and Marston says, "You're late, Constantine." And John looks at him and says, "Yeah, enjoy your walk home?" And Marston looks at him and says, "I didn't walk. I used a form of public transport, commonly known as the tube. It was very full of scum and disagreeable people. Presumably, you won't be returning my keys?" And then John looks at him with disgust and lights a cigarette and says, "Petty, aren't I? Let's cut the shit, Marston. What do you want?" And Marston answers, "I want you to come with me, Constantine. I have sights to show you and things to tell you, and then I want to discuss business. And yes, you're right, we shall cut the shit." So then we cut to them walking through some gates and into some secret elevator, it looks like. And as they're going down, Marston is talking to John saying, "You are now on the premises of the Caligula Club, Constantine. Have you ever heard of it?" John says no, and Masterson continues, "Well, I'm not surprised. I know you're famous for finding out about things, but we're not famous for anything." And then we see the light for a floor labeled C lights up, and as they walk out of the elevator, they are immediately in a room full of debauchery. And the narration says, "A couple of seconds for Constantine's eyes to adjust to the light, and he begins to recognize some of these people, and he sees what they're doing." So Marston begins to walk John through the club, and we get some panels of all the stuff that's going on. We're seeing people drinking cups of their own blood. There's definitely some fetish stuff going on, people in lots of leather and masks. And John looks at Marston and says, "Club for rich sickos, huh?" And Marston answers, "Oh, much more." And then John sees someone he doesn't expect to be there, and he says, "Hang on, that's..." And then Marston cuts in, I know. He's taking some time off from writing his memoirs. This is a club for those with power, Constantine, because power creates unusual tensions in people. And the greater the power, the more unusual the release. Tension demands release. Unusual tensions demands release that can be only described as appalling. The richest, most powerful, most famous men and women in the world come here, Constantine. We provide them with general entertainment and individual attention, ranging from simple sadistic perversion to actual murder. And they go away quite refreshed. And why? And then John looks at him revoltingly and says, because you're a pack of... But Marsden cuts him off saying, no! The real answer is best illustrated by an incident that occurred here 5 years ago. And as Marston is telling the story, he's bringing John over to a bar and he orders 2 drinks. And as they're standing at the bar, Marston begins to drink and John is not drinking. He's just standing there kind of sick. And Marston continues. A young journalist of immense intelligence and resource infiltrated the club one Saturday night. It was a typical bash. Most of the cabinet were here, chairmen of several consortiums, celebrities, and so on. The Prime Minister was here too, being shaved. The journalist carefully photographed everything and then was caught. He was completely unfazed and boasted about how he would print the truth and destroy us. I was very understanding with him. I can remember the very words I used too. Better our perverse energies should be applied here than in affairs of the state. Good, isn't it? What seems like common sense, coupled with the threat of something unthinkable. He burnt the film himself, and then I blew his brains out with a Webley .454. Lord Browning's party dined on his heart, I seem to remember. And just as Marston finishes his story, the bartender begins to pull out a large glass jar and set it on the counter, and a bunch of people begin to gather. Now, these people look like caricatures of actual people that maybe exist in Parliament or something from the early 90s, but I'm not sure because I'm not that familiar with British Parliament and celebrities and royalty of Britain in the 90s. So as these people gather around the bar, we see the bartender take out 2 cats that look very, very emaciated, and Marston says, "Oh, splendid. I was going to take you aside for a private word, but watch this first." And all the onlookers begin to cheer as the bartender puts the 2 cats inside of the glass jar, closes the lid, and they watch the cats tear each other apart. And the people are yelling, "Fight! Fight, you little figures! He's got him by the throat! Rip him! Jesus, it's pulled the bone out of its leg! This is brilliant! Kill!" And as the people are yelling this stuff, John looks sick to his stomach. He looks disgusted and super angry. And then we cut to John and Marston walking down some hallway. And Marston is explaining to John what he just watched. And Marston says, "Shaved, starved cats. You wouldn't believe one president of the United States fell asleep during that. Bloody Philistine. The president incumbent is more our sort of chap." And I believe that the president he's talking about is George Bush Sr. So John says, "I've had enough of this, Marston. Either you tell me what you want me for right now, or I'll send you straight to hell. What's it going to be?" And this takes Marston by surprise, because he knows John dabbles in magic and stuff, but he doesn't know the extent of John's powers. So he looks kind of taken aback and scared at that proposition. And the narration says, "That's another thing Marston dislikes Constantine for. He's never quite sure what the man is. Just when you've got him off balance on your own home ground, he says something like that and tips the scales in an instant. Threat or bluff? Surely Constantine couldn't send him to... And then we get 2 panels where John is just staring him down like he for sure means that he will send Marston to hell. And Marston is looking back at John very scared and he says, "Very well. After you, Constantine, then I'll explain." And he leads John into a room that's got 2 candles on a table, and then on the floor it looks like there's some sort of symbol, and on top of that symbol is something covered with a sheet. And as they walk in, Marston says, "As you've seen, we provide people with just about anything they want. Last night, a member of the club, a rather famous gentleman, arrived here with a friend of his and a young woman they'd picked up on the streets. They drank at the bar for a while, then they came to this private room. It was New Year's Eve, and things were, of course, quite unrestrained in the main room. We didn't hear anything. I called on them myself later, but it's not an easy thing to put into words." And as Marston looks down at the ground guiltily, John looks at him and says, "Would it have anything to do with what's on the floor?" And John points to what's being covered with his foot. And as Marston removes the sheet, John is saying, "Pretty complicated with all these little symbols. Whatever they called up here, it must have been pretty special to wipe half the pentacle off the floor." And as Marston reveals under the sheet, he says, It left this too." And he reveals in the center of this pentagram 2 full skeletons that are completely void of any muscle or any other tissue. And John yells, "Jesus!" And then he composes himself and continues. "Okay, Marston, look, you've got what looks like a major summoning. Little blade marks all over the floor, and 2 corpses that look like they got hit in the same way as that kid they found this morning. Now I wonder why I'm here." And Marston looks at John with gritted teeth and answers, "It's not as easy as all that. The gentleman I mentioned, he wasn't one of those 2. I think he's, and John cuts in, possessed? Safe bet. You're good at setting up orgies for the scum of the earth, Marston, but you know sod all about this stuff. And I'm going to be the one who hunts down your gentleman and gets rid of his guest, right?" And then he looks at Marston super serious and continues, "Maybe I will and maybe I won't. But there's something you haven't told me yet, Marston. Who is this gentleman?" And Marston hesitantly answers, he's, oh God, this is awful. He is considered above reproach. He is loved and respected both here and abroad. He's a very prominent member of the royal family." And upon hearing this, John gets a big smile on his face and says, "Oh, good. I think I'm going to enjoy this one." And that is the end of the issue. And I looked this up because I wasn't exactly sure who he was talking about. And it's funny because this is kind of hidden because I guess they can't name him by name in the comic. And even in like DC Wikipedia sites, it was hard to figure out exactly who they were saying, but most of them called him the Prince of Wales. So I looked up who the Prince of Wales was in 1992, and who they're talking about is Charles III, who is now King Charles because his mom just died. And it also makes sense because they were talking about his wife being pretty and beloved, and they're talking about Princess Diana. And of course, this is for people who are not on top of British royalty, such as myself. So I figured I'd fill you guys in. And I love that Garth Ennis is ballsy enough to write a story about Prince Charles getting possessed by a demon and murdering people. But I love that John gets super excited when he hears who it is. But that's it for this one. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains@comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.